So let's say, and you mentioned it's going to take an act of Congress literally to fully eliminate the Department of Education. When you hear that certain states and organizations are going to be filing lawsuits to prevent this from happening, when it comes to the legal standpoint, what would the argument be for the states, and what are the challenges to winning those lawsuits? Could they actually prevent this from happening?
It's a great question. So in order to try to prevent this from happening, usually if there's a preventative issue, most citizens can't file lawsuits themselves, right? Usually there has to be some sort of harm that already occurs in order for you to be able to file a lawsuit. Not in this case. The attorneys general can get together and say there will be a harm that comes to students if the Department of Education is closed. Like they won't be able to receive Pell Grants. Pell Grants are grants that are issued to students who otherwise wouldn't have the financial means to go to college. Or perhaps Title I funding, which is specifically for schools in low-income areas. If students are not able to access the resources that they need because they weren't given the funding that was originally promised to them, then the attorneys general can get together and say, we are suing the executive branch on behalf of the people who were not given the resources that they needed.
So let's say that does in fact happen. When it comes to the timeline, how would this delay, if anything, the action currently in the works right now? Would it put a halt to it? Would everything proceed as usual, in conjunction, in tandem with these lawsuits? How would that work?
Sure. So in terms of a timeline, it depends. As we have seen with some of the other executive orders that the president has tried to push through, there have been some injunctions that are filed. As we've seen with, for example, deportations, the executive branch is either choosing to follow what the courts say or not. So it depends on whether or not the court that receives these cases will decide to put an injunction, which just means preventing anything from moving forward whatsoever. But as we've seen previously, the executive branch has chosen to ignore that in some cases in terms of enforcement. So it'll all just depend.
Now, in terms of ramifications legally, if the executive branch, if President Trump and his administration choose to continue to move forward, what are those ramifications if they decide not to follow the court orders? What happens next?
Yeah, so I think what we see often when we are talking about separation of powers issue is a lot of confusion, because the founders in the Constitution, right, they created those three separate branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And they're supposed to be co-equal branches of government. However, in certain instances, the executive branch can take on a little bit more authority. Still, the executive and still the judicial and the legislative need to provide a check. And so I think actually what we're going to see is how the public is going to react if the executive in the executive branch is going to try to consolidate more power in the executive branch than we're used to seeing, and how far the American people are willing to go in terms of accepting how much power is consolidated there. So because this is unprecedented, I don't know exactly how things are going to turn out with the courts, but I do know that President Trump has a history of wanting to give the people what they want, or enjoying giving the people what they want. So I think if there is backlash in terms of not respecting the co-equal branches of government, I think that the president will likely respond to that.
Well, it's certainly going to be interesting. And as you mentioned, unprecedented. So we're, in uncharted territory right here. Madeline, as always, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.